we can just edit. Good morning, everyone. Welcome, welcome. We're excited to have you all here today, and I see some people are still connecting to audio, so you know the drill if you've been here before. Let us know in the chat who you are, where you're joining us from, and what organization you're with. And we'll probably get started right at the top of the hour. I do want to give everyone a heads up. There is a chance that this session might go a couple minutes over. There was just some really great content I could not cut out. So hopefully everybody can give us an extra like 3 minutes. If not, the recording will be available later on this week. Anyone from Minot? Are you guys excited for the fair? I about lost my mind when somebody told me that it was starting on Friday, because I was like, no, it's 2 weeks away. It's 2 weeks away. But nope, here we are. Jessica said, time flies when it's summer. It sure does. I always think that the fair is like the indication of the last part of summer, but I'm like, okay, nope, it's a week earlier this year, so I think we should be fine. We still got plenty of time to get out to the lake and enjoy the nice weather. Well, we'll give everybody... Oh, Lisa, you love the fair. That's funny. I guess I wouldn't take you as somebody who loves the fair. I just found out the concert I wanted to go to sold out, and I did not think it was going to sell out. So now I'm going to be one of those people asking for tickets online. So anybody who has an extra ticket on Saturday and isn't, gouging the prices, let me know. I might buy the ticket from you.
Hey, same. I'm looking for one too.
Please, somebody help Kyle and I go to Lil Wayne.
I can't help you. I'll be listening from right outside.
Well, I might join you, Lisa, because it doesn't look like I have a ticket.
We'll start our own little mini crib outside the concert.
Yeah, Kyle, you and I will just go hang out outside the concert.
Yeah,
with everybody
good.
Afterwards. All right, we'll give everybody about 1 more minute and then we'll get started. For those who just joined, welcome, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about understanding ableism to provide better quality supports, and we're very excited for this presentation. It is a new one to this series. We just felt like since it landed in July, it made sense to talk about this topic. So we're really excited that you all are here to engage in this discussion with us. And just giving everybody a heads up, this session might go over a couple minutes. I'm going to try my best to wrap it up early, but there was a lot of really great quality content that I just couldn't figure out where to trim it. So we'll go ahead and get started here since we're looking at 11:02. Welcome, everybody. This is the 9th session of the Direct Care Resilience series, and today we're going to talk about understanding ableism so we can provide better quality supports to the people that we're working with. I think you guys can all see my screen. I'm just pulling up my notes here. So for this session, we really wanted to celebrate Disability Pride Month. Disability Pride aligns with the July 1990 passing of the ADA, and this observance aims to promote visibility and mainstream awareness of the positive pride felt by those within the disability community. And disability pride is defined as accepting and honoring each person's uniqueness and seeing it as a natural and beautiful part of human diversity. Disability pride is an integral part of an inclusive crusade, and it directly challenges systemic ableism and stigmatizing definitions of disability. So for today, we're going to be focusing on defining ableism and how it impacts our work. By the end of this, I'm hoping that you can recognize ableist attitudes and behaviors in both personal and professional settings. And towards the end, we're also going to practice a self-reflection exercise to become more aware of the everyday interactions that are impacted by ableism. And I want to highlight that there has been a movement in identity-first language where some people choose to call themselves disabled instead of that person first, which is a person with a disability. As a professional, I typically default to person-first language unless somebody requests otherwise. But today, in the spirit of disability pride, this presentation is going to use identity-first language, and I'm going to feature some of my favorite disabled scholars and activists. So before we jump in, I just want to ask you, who are some of your favorite disabled, or who are some of your disabled heroes or role models? And this could be anybody. This could be celebrities, activists, influencers, family members, friends, colleagues. Go ahead and put that in the chat. This is a great way to not only celebrate some of the great accomplishments of our favorite people with disabilities that are contributing to the industry, but also gives us some more people to look into if you don't have that many people on your list. Oh, Andrew Gazura's social media account. I've never seen that, or I've never heard of him, so I'm going to definitely check that out. Thank you, Miranda. Go ahead and keep putting that in there, but I'm going to move on to our next slide. So what is ableism? Ableism is the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. So at its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing, and it defines people by their disability. So just like racism and sexism, ableism classifies entire groups of people as less than, and it includes harmful stereotypes, misconceptions, and generalizations of disabled people. And I want to highlight a quote from one of my favorite disability activists, Alice Wong, who has kind of a beautiful definition of disability, or beautiful lens on disability. So she says, disabled people have always existed, whether the word disability is used or not. To me, disability is not a monolith, nor is it a clear-cut binary of disabled and non-disabled. Disability is mutable and ever evolving. Disability is both apparent and non-apparent. Disability is pain, struggle, brilliance, abundance, and joy. Disability is sociopolitical, cultural, and biological. Being visible and claiming a disabled identity brings as much risks as it does bring pride. So I want to highlight that ableism operates in many ways, and it can happen at the institutional level. This is within health and human service policy and procedures. So at the institutional level, this form of ableism infects entire institutions. So a prime example is medical ableism, which is rooted in the idea that disability of any kind is a problem that needs to be fixed. And it's important to note that when this is part of a medical teaching and health policy, it affects entire healthcare systems and the well-being of patients. And we see that a lot here, especially in Western society. Ableism can also operate at an interpersonal level in social interactions and relationships. An example of this might be a parent of a child with a disability who might try to cure the disability rather than accept it and teach that child how to live with it. And ableism also happens at an internal level. So internalized ableism is where a person consciously or unconsciously believes the harmful messages that they hear about disability and they apply it to themselves. So for example, someone might feel like disability accommodations are a privilege and not a right. And I found this nice little infographic that talks about, or that showcases some of those internalized ableist statements that people tell themselves. These could be, I can't be disabled because I can do things that others can't. I'm not trying hard enough to get better. I'm faking it. I'm a burden. Other people are far worse off than me. No one will love me because I'm disabled, and it's my fault I'm feeling like this. And I did show this graphic to my friend who has a disability, and he confirmed that he has told himself every single one of these statements. So this is something to keep in mind, that the people that you're supporting this could be their inner monologue and their inner self-talk that they might be dealing with every single day. So what does ableism look like? And these images kind of show what happens in interpersonal relationships. So asking somebody what's wrong with them. I think this graphic is a little too kind, saying that it's nice to show that you care and you want to learn more, but think about how you might go about asking this, or just don't ask it at all, in my opinion. Saying you don't look disabled or you don't look sick. This is very, very damaging, especially when it is said as if it were a compliment, because people may feel like they have to prove their disability. Saying somebody that is inspirational for doing typical things like having a career. This is very, very condescending, because it kind of shows this assumption that we didn't think that they were able to have a career because they have a disability. Ableism can look like assuming a physical disability is a product of laziness or a lack of exercise or not trying hard enough. One of my favorite disability activists, Amani Barber, and she talks about this a lot, where she deals with like fat phobia whenever she goes into a doctor's office. She said that one time she thought she had strep throat, so she went to a doctor to get some antibiotics and some testing to see if that was what was actually happening, and found the doctor just told her, nope, you're overweight, you need to exercise. And she left that office without any medicine to treat the actual illness that she was experiencing at the time. So ableism can also look like questioning whether a person's disability is real. I think this happens a lot, especially if there's a non-apparent disability. And it's important to note that disability can look like anything and everything, because disabilities are so dynamic. Asking questions like, what do you do all day, or what do you do for work? This perpetuates that notion that a person is only valuable if or when they're productive. I like to also talk about or attribute this to internalized capitalism. Ableism can be something like making a comment like it must be nice to stay home or not full time. And I love that they bolded this, because some people are forced to stay home because they're dealing with either not enough accommodations or flat out discrimination with getting a job. And finally, ableism can look like using public facilities that are meant for people with disabilities, like parking spaces or toilets. So now that we kind of have an understanding of what ableism is, let's talk about where it stems from. And it's really important to note that how people think about disability affects how they feel about it. And these viewpoints can be categorized into three overarching models of disability: the moral, medical, and social models. So in the moral model, disability is seen as having meaning about a person or a family's character, deeds, thoughts, and karma. So from this perspective, disability can carry a lot of stigma, shame, and blame, particularly if the disability is seen as a mark of wrongdoing. And I know that this probably sounds like a really archaic model, but it is actually the most prevalent worldwide. And we often see it portrayed in Western media, where disability is portrayed as evil. So you see this a lot in horror movies where villains have some sort of disfigurement, but we also see it in children's movies. So for example, like Captain Hook and Scar are literally named after their disabilities, and a lot of their motives are based on getting revenge because of how they acquired their disability. So moving on to the medical model views disability as a direct result of abnormalities in the body or mind, which it aims to cure. So from this perspective, the goal is to return the system or the function as close to normal as possible. And it's interesting because the medical model also suggests that professionals with specialized training are the experts in disability, and disabled people are expected to follow the advice of these experts. Sometimes we see this model in movies where the plot includes a disabled person being depressed and hopeless, but then they have a friendship with an able-bodied person. They then learn to embrace life. And finally, we have the social model, which asserts that society is the primary cause of disability and that the problem lies in society, not the individual. So it acknowledges that people are disabled by their social environment, such as inaccessibility, discrimination, and oppression. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in the upcoming slides. But to go a little bit more in depth, I want to share this talk by Stella Young. So while some of you have maybe seen this TED Talk before, it's definitely worth a rewatch. I've seen it probably like 10 times and I still have takeaways from it. So I'll go ahead and play this for y'all.
I grew up in a very small country town in Victoria. I had a very normal, low-key kind of upbringing. I went to school, I hung out with my friends, I fought with my younger sisters. It was all very normal. And when I was 15, a member of my local community approached my parents and wanted to nominate me for a Community Achievement Award. And my parents said, that's really nice, but there's kind of one glaring problem with that. She hasn't actually achieved anything. Yeah, and they were right. I went to school, I got good marks, I had a very low-key after-school job in my mum's hairdressing salon, and I spent a lot of time watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Dawson's Creek. Yeah, I know, what a contradiction. But they were right. I wasn't doing anything that was out of the ordinary at all. I wasn't doing anything that could be considered an achievement if you took disability out of the equation. Years later, I was on my second teaching round in a Melbourne high school, And I was about 20 minutes into a year 11 legal studies class when this boy put up his hand and said, "Hey, miss, when are you going to start doing your speech?" And I said, "What speech?" I'd been talking to them about defamation law for a good 20 minutes. And he said, like your motivational speaking. When people in wheelchairs come to school, they usually say, like, inspirational stuff. It's usually in the big hall. And that's when it dawned on me. This kid had only ever experienced disabled people as objects of inspiration. We are not, to this kid, and it's not his fault. I mean, that's true for many of us. For lots of us, disabled people are not our teachers or our doctors or our manicurists. We're not real people. We are there to inspire. And in fact, I'm sitting on this stage looking like I do in this wheelchair, and you are probably kind of expecting me to inspire you, right? Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you dramatically. I'm not here to inspire you. I'm here to tell you that we have been lied to about disability. Yeah, we've been sold the lie that disability is a bad thing. Capital B, capital T. It's a bad thing. And to live with disability makes you exceptional. It's not a bad thing, and it doesn't make you exceptional. And in the past few years, we've been able to propagate this lie even further via social media. You may have seen images like this one. The only disability in life is a bad attitude. Or this one. Your excuse is invalid, indeed. Or this one. Before you quit, try. Yeah. These are just a couple of examples, but there are a lot of these images out there. You might have seen the one, the little girl with no hands drawing a picture with a pencil held in her mouth. You might have seen a child running on carbon fibre prosthetic legs. And these images, there are lots of them out there. They are what we call inspiration porn. And I use the term porn deliberately because they objectify one group of people for the benefit of another group of people. So in this case, we're objectifying disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. The purpose of these images is to inspire you, to motivate you, so that we can look at them and think, well, however bad my life is, it could be worse. I could be that person. But what if you are that person? I've lost count of the number of times that I've been approached by strangers wanting to tell me that they think I'm brave or inspirational. And this was long before my work had any kind of public profile. They were just kind of congratulating me for managing to get up in the morning and remember my own name. And it is objectifying. These images objectify disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. They are there so that you can look at them and think that things aren't so bad for you, to put your worries into perspective. And life as a disabled person is actually somewhat difficult. We do overcome some things. But the things that we're overcoming are not the things that you think they are. They are not things to do with our bodies. I use the term disabled people quite deliberately because I subscribe to what's called the social model of disability, which tells us that we are more disabled by our bodies, the society that we live in rather, than by our bodies and our diagnoses. So I've lived in this body a long time. I'm quite fond of it. It does the things that I need it to do, and I've learnt to use it to the best of its capacity, just as you have. And that's the thing about those kids in those pictures as well. They're not doing anything out of the ordinary. They are just using their bodies to the best of their capacity. So is it really fair to objectify them in the way that we do, to share those images? People, when they say, you're an inspiration, they mean it as a compliment. They mean it as a compliment. And I know why it happens. It's because of the lie. It's because we've been sold this lie that disability makes you exceptional. And it honestly doesn't. And I know what you're thinking. You know, I'm up here bagging out inspiration. And you're thinking, geez, Stella, aren't you inspired sometimes by some things? And the thing is, I am. I learn from other disabled people all the time. I'm learning not that I am luckier than them, though. I am learning that it's a genius idea to use a pair of barbecue tongs to pick up things that you drop. I'm learning that nifty trick where you can charge your mobile phone battery from your chair battery. Genius. We are learning from each other's strength and endurance, not against our bodies and our diagnoses, but against a world that exceptionalizes and objectifies us. I really think that this lie that we've been sold about disability is the greatest injustice. It makes life hard for us. And that quote, "the only disability in life is a bad attitude," the reason that that's bullshit is because it's just not true. Because of the social model of disability, you know, no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a rap. Never.
So I want to know what's on your mind. In the chat, let me know if there was any key takeaways from that video, any questions so far, or anything that you need clarification on, maybe any aha moments. I agree. Rebecca says she is very good. I'm curious, was that the first time you've ever seen this video? It's been around since 2014. Okay, good. Karen says, I won't call it inspirational. However, it did give a great idea or a great deal of insight. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone. So we'll go ahead and keep on going. And I want to highlight how ableism impacts everything in human services. So in 2024, the Council on Quality of Leadership, also CQL, which many of you in the audience are probably familiar with them, did a study on disabilities professionals' understanding of ableism, because in order to stop being ableist, you really need to understand what it is and how it works. And I really appreciated these studies because they highlight, you know, this is not a calling out, this is a calling in, because the more that we learn, the better our service provisions. So this study found that while 72% of professionals said they knew what ableism was, only about 48% of them actually did. And the study was interesting because many professionals described ableism as the discrimination and differential treatment. And they also mentioned that individualization is a key role in ableism. So they got all of that right. And I do want to highlight that individualization is the system where disabled people are portrayed as needing to be fixed, and they are seen as responsible for their own situation. But, you know, as we've been talking about, when disability is individualized, the environmental and systemic barriers are ignored. So while disability professionals got a lot of things right about ableism, they got some things wrong too. Some of them actually expressed ableist ideas themselves without even realizing it. So one example was, well, some disability professionals were using ableist language to describe disabilities. There were others who wouldn't even say the word disability. And the authors pointed out that when people avoid saying disability, it's because there's this underlying assumption that disability is negative, and this is ableist. So the study found that, you know, it was really common for disability professionals to frame disability as either related to inability or ability, so focusing on what people can or can't do. And many of these professionals thought that disabled people were discriminated against because of their inability to achieve things. And this is really problematic because it assumes that disabled people are lower in ability, but it assumes that disability is all about if a person can achieve something. So not only is this false, but it also individualizes disability once again, where you're blaming the person for their situation and ignoring the many barriers that are placed in people's way. And I really like this image here where it talks about some of the social barriers that you encounter within the social model of disability. So one of the social barriers is the environment being inaccessible. This includes public buildings, services. It can be boiled down to language and communication. Some other social barriers are attitudes such as prejudice, stereotyping, and flat out discrimination. We see this a lot with job searches. And we also see social barriers within organizations and human service organizations where there's inflexible procedures and policies. And I really like this study because they flat out asked this question: have you ever asked yourself, why do people actually need to be taught to treat disabled people with dignity and respect? Gonna let that marinate for a second. So it's not to imply that doing so isn't helpful or that dignity and respect isn't an important topic, but why is this type of education even needed in the first place? Why aren't disabled people already respected simply because they're people? And that's because we take away people's choices, opportunities, and even rights away from them based on the assumptions about what they're capable of and what they're interested in. And I've seen this a lot within the guardianship process. So I think in about 2018, we were doing an election training to teach people how to make a voting plan for an upcoming election. And we had a lot of people that were interested in voting, many of them for the first time in their lives. And so out of curiosity, one of my team members decided to look into their guardianship documents to see if anybody that we were training on how to vote had their right to vote restricted through the guardianship process. And I personally did not think that there was going to be that many. We were shocked that about 30% of the people throughout the whole entire agency that we served had their right to vote restricted through the court process. And these weren't people that were living in like the ICF settings that had, profound and severe disabilities. There was a lot of people that were living in their own apartments and receiving minimal support. Yes, Karen, that is very frightening. So I could probably give you a list of like several hundred things that I've seen throughout my career, but I want to ask you, what are some examples that you can think of where somebody's choice, opportunities, and rights were restricted based on assumptions of what they're capable of? This doesn't have to be like the guardianship process, just everyday services. Where have we seen this? And Kyle, he'll put that question in the chat just for clarification of what I'm asking. So what examples can you think of where somebody's choice, opportunities, and rights were restricted based on assumptions of what they can or what they're capable of? Lisa points out that some states automatically restrict the right to vote when guardianship is appointed. Absolutely. Rebecca said that, remembering as a kid in a small town, they would have children ride the bus to school and transport them to special education at a different location, and grew up thinking that they were special because that's what we were fed our whole lives. Miranda, that's a great example. Romantic relationships are often restricted. No access to the stove because they might get burnt. Jessica says it started in elementary school. Kids with disabilities were in a different class and they would maybe pop in for lunches or assembly, but they were never included in the typical day at school. Yep, absolutely. Oh, Kyle, interesting. Some people give him strange looks when he goes to the liquor store. Some service providers, you're not even allowed to drink alcohol or purchase it. Work environments, Shannon sees it daily. People with disability have their rights taken away way too easily. No access to sex or sexual education because everyone assumes that the person with the disability is asexual. These are fantastic examples. And like I said, it's something that happens every single day in our jobs. And I want to highlight this really great quote from that study. It's not because people are incapable, it's because we serve as the gatekeepers when we believe people are not capable and when we treat adults like children. We restrict their lives based on our own ableist ideas, even in some ways that we may not realize. So CQL, they have some really great resources for addressing ableism within human service organizations. I encourage you to take a look at this slide later, but I am going to move on because I want to focus more on how do we reframe support into allyship? And I've talked about this before in previous sessions. Like, I think it would be so beneficial if we stopped seeing ourselves as those gatekeepers, and rather we are there to empower people. So to start thinking more about your role as an ally, one of the first steps is to educate yourself. I also do want to highlight the National Association of County and City Health Officials had a person with a disability define ally as someone who supports the cause of a marginalized group. So this could be women, people of color, people with disabilities, people in the L+ community, those with low income, etc. And they use their privilege to learn from that group and amplify their cause. And if you remember from our previous sessions, ally is a verb, it is not a title. So some strategies to get started is starting with educating yourself, learning, and in some cases, unlearning is that first step in allyship. So you can read books on the history of systemic inequality, immerse yourself in the stories of people who have different backgrounds and experiences than you. That's actually why I asked that question early on, so that we can start writing down some of these role models that have influenced us, because just practicing listening to their stories is a great place to start. And it shouldn't end there either. So we also need to resist assuming what others need. So in previous sessions, I had shared with this group the coaching habit. And one of the key takeaways from that book is that your advice is not as good as you think it is. And it's important to note that not everyone wants you to step in and advocate on their behalf. So it's important to really ask people what they want and need from you, and don't assume that you know what's best from them or for them. The third point here that I purposely put in all capitalized letters is practice the art of listening. Allyship is about being conscious and intentional, and that means learning to truly listen to others, because through their experience, though their experiences might be different from yours, this is a pathway to greater empathy by listening to them and staying curious about them. We also do not want to put people into boxes. Humans are multifaceted. Each of us have a distinct set of experiences that makes us who we are. And allyship creates opportunities for us to share our experiences and identity with each other, so that we feel connected to a broader whole and that we belong. And that sense of belonging impacts not only the mood and the temperament of each person, especially in these working relationships, but yeah, it also helps us work together in a much better way. And finally, recognizing that privilege is power. Privilege does not mean that you haven't worked hard to get where you are, or that you haven't faced hardships in your own life. Every single one of us has some form of privilege. This could be being able-bodied, this could be being college educated or neurotypical. Some people's privileges add up to be greater than others, and allyship is all about using those privileges that we have so we can advocate for those who don't have those same advantages. So I do want to highlight the term neurotypical. It's short for neurologically typical, which means someone who doesn't have any kind of mental, psychiatric, learning, cognitive, intellectual, or developmental disability. So basically, neurotypical means your brain is considered normal and healthy. I didn't put my hands up high enough. Normal and healthy in quotation marks. So to learn a little bit more about this, we're gonna go over Autistic Hoya's brief able-bodied privilege checklist. Kyle's going to put a link to this checklist in the chat. Thank you again, Kyle, for doing that. And this was developed by Lydia X.E. Brown, who is an attorney and disability rights activist. Huge fan of their work. And actually, they were the first non-binary person that I had ever come across. So I always have a fondness in my heart for somebody who just helped me grow and be a better human. So this checklist is meant to be an educational tool to help people with and without disabilities become more aware of the interactions or observances that are impacted by ableism. But before we begin, I want to read through their privilege statement, because I think this is a really great way to help people become more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I know that privilege can be one of those kind of triggering words that puts people on the defense. So let's go ahead and explore what privilege actually is. So number one, privilege is not your fault. This is an artifact of systems that favor some people over others, and systems have naturally evolved to meet the needs of the majority, and they fail to provide adequate accommodations for those outside of it. Privilege in itself, it's not a terrible thing. Having any form of privilege does not make you a bad person, and just about everybody has some form of privilege, but that doesn't necessarily mean it somehow balances out. So a person can have, for example, white privilege, male privilege, class privilege, and heterosexual privilege, while also lacking neurotypical privilege, meaning that person might have autism. But likewise, not all autistic people have the same experiences, so many forms of privilege can act as a cushion against some of the harsher realities endured by those who belong to multiple disenfranchised groups. And finally, the statement that privilege exists is not an accusation or attempt to blame. It's an invitation for you to see your experiences and the experiences of others in a new light. So let's take a moment to open up that checklist and take a look at it. And we're not going to have a time to go through every single one of these, but let's kind of look through these and let me know, are there any of these that stand out to you? Have you seen this in the wild before? Have you experienced any of these? And do some of them seem like they're just not possible? Like no human would ever say that to another human? As always, to keep me from panic talking, I'm going to put on a little bit of music so that we have enough time for everybody to take a look through this and put your thoughts in the chat. Or feel free to unmute if you feel comfortable. I'm going to scroll down just a little bit so we can look at some of these other ones. I think number 14 is really interesting. Random total strangers will generally not ask me very personal, invasive medical questions, especially if I'm not transgender. So if they do, they're considered extremely rude for their questions, and their questions are considered inappropriate and embarrassing.
The one that I always gets me is number 12. I get to choose to sit wherever I want, wherever I get to an event, a restaurant, movie theater, religious event. We had an individual that was coming to our university, and this was her first time, coming to college. And the professors was like, "Oh, we have her spot for her right up front," and they set up a desk for her right up front, literally next to the professor's desk. And it was one of the 100 level classes. So there was like 400 kids in the class, but her desk was right up front. And I said, "How did you know that she wants to sit right up front?" I said, "Why doesn't she get to choose her spot like everybody else?" And he was like, "Well, I guess I didn't know where she wanted to sit." I'm like, "Well, how about we ask her?" Oh, yeah. So just very frustrating, those things where they always pick and choose where they have to sit.
That's an excellent example. And thank you for providing also an example of how you acted as an ally in that moment.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
because you throw in that power dynamic too. You have a student who's being treated differently by their professor, and if it's the first day of school, you're probably
Yeah.
not going to want to leave a bad impression and look demanding. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yep.
thank you, Dee, for sharing that. Are there any other examples that may stick out to people?
I get weird medical questions all the time.
Just out in public by total strangers?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to share one of the most weird statements you've been asked or questions you've been asked?
So, okay, this gonna might gross people out, but whatever, let's do it. When I go out on dates, one of the first questions that pops up is if a certain body part works.
I'm gonna steal Jessica's famous statement. I have nothing nice to say.
Yeah, exactly.
It's so funny. Yeah, would you ever ask that to anybody else in your life?
No, and it's just always a wild question to me.
Yeah. Do you have like a snarky answer for it?
I do, but I can't say it in a professional setting.
Okay, proud of you. There was one of these, I can't remember which number it was, but the first time that I had ever come across this checklist, there was one statement in there that says like, people have never said to me they would rather be dead than like live with the condition that I have. And when I read that the first time, I was like, that can't be a thing. Like, that can't be a thing. Like, who would ever say that? And sure enough, it is. I had a friend who wanted to get better at public speaking. She was going for her master's degree and knew that she was going to be given a lot of presentations. So her and her other disabled friend joined a Toastmasters group. And I think her friend shared a speech about the story of how they acquired their disability later in life, and how they adapted and learned to live with it. And as they were leaving, one of the fellow Toastmaster members jumped in the elevator with them and was like, "Oh, I can't believe that. If that ever happened to me, I'd rather be dead." And I'm just like shocked that somebody would ever have the audacity to say that to somebody. But it happens. So don't let being naive trick you. And I saw Kyle was nodding his head too. So I have a feeling that he has maybe experienced that as well. So like I said, we're probably not. Oh,
Can I share one?
yeah.
I should have listed this person as one of my disability heroes. Kia Brown is an author who has cerebral palsy, and she started the hashtag disabled and cute that went viral. But she wrote a book about her experiences, and she uses a wheelchair at times, and how much she cannot stand the gravestone of the kid. It's like a statue of a wheelchair, but the kid is like coming out of the wheelchair at the gravestone, and how there's this, it was getting pushed around everywhere of like, oh, she's finally free from the wheelchair, and how much that bothered her because she really, loves everything that her wheelchair lets her do, and just kind of like, well, this is my life. So it kind of feels like they're saying like, oh, you're stuck in this wheelchair, you're better off. So there was a chapter about that in her book. I just thought might be relevant to share.
I can kind of relate to that because I love being in a wheelchair. I can do some wild stuff in this thing. So I don't, I completely can relate.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we've all been trained at some point where like wheelchairs are liberating, because without it, you're stuck, So yeah, why are we stigmatizing using a mobility device? Okay, so along the same lines, doctors judging whether to treat a serious illness because they think the person's quality of life is already poor. That was huge during the pandemic. I can share some great podcasts on that towards or at the end of this presentation. All right, so I want to recognize like this is kind of a rough topic. So let's, I'm gonna launch a poll and I want to see how everybody's feeling. Can everybody see that poll? So do me a favor and let me know, out of these feelings, where are you at right now? Just so I can get a kind of a pulse on the mood. We'll give it about 3 more seconds. All right, I'm gonna end it. I'm gonna share the results. Can y'all see the results? Okay, so it looks like we're all feeling kind of neutral, fortunate, enlightened, and we have a couple that are feeling shame. So thank you for sharing that. I do actually want to recognize those who are courageous enough to say that they feel shame. We've all probably said and done some of the ableist things that are featured in this presentation, and I really want to highlight that this does not mean you're a bad person. This is something we've been conditioned from a very, very young age by society, that this is just the way things are. So like I said, if you've done some of these things, I need all of the above option. that actually would have been really great, Roberta. So, I just want to highlight what matters is that you're here now, you're showing a willingness to learn, you're showing a willingness to grow and do better. So with that, I do want to highlight one person whose work I've really come to admire is Brene Brown. She's a researcher who studies shame, vulnerability, and resilience. And I see so much overlap in her research in our field and how it applies to our field. So we're gonna watch this video. It is a little bit longer, it's about 30 minutes, but I really think it drives home everything that we've talked about, like not only in this presentation, but this entire series. So just to give you a little bit of context, she gave this talk to some teachers, and it takes place in a classroom setting, but I do think that it's generalizable to our field and within our own programs. And I do want to point out that you are going to hear a little bit of ableist language, and it's just important to note that ableism is kind of one of those forgotten isms, and this is kind of what it looks like in the wild. She doesn't say anything overtly ableist that we might think of, like the R word by any means. Just words like crazy and I think maybe stupid gets thrown around in there. So I just want to acknowledge that, but also still celebrate the amazing work that is Brene Brown. So I'm going to start this video and I'm going to mute my.
What I'm actually going to talk to you about today is the number one thing that gets in the way of developing courage and building courageous classrooms. We're going to start with vulnerability, and then I'm going to talk to you about shame. And I'm going to tell you why I've decided to talk about shame today. Because I feel really comfortable with you, and I think you're a fearless group of people, and I don't think we can pretend that this is not getting in the way. I don't think we can say, this is not happening in homes, this is not happening in the environment we live in right now. This is part of the landscape, and it's become worse over the last 6 months. And so I want to talk about it. But let's start with vulnerability, and let's start with the willingness to be vulnerable, the willingness to really show up and let people in. How many of you were raised to believe that vulnerability is weakness? Most of us. Here's what I can tell you, and I'll challenge you, yell up if you can think of something. I cannot find in 200,000 pieces of data a single example of courage that was not completely defined by vulnerability. Let me challenge you. Can you think of one courageous thing that you have seen someone do in your life that did not require vulnerability, that did not require uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure? One thing. I find zero evidence. And let me tell you, I've stood in front of a group like this of special force military people. They can't think of a single example of courage that did not require absolute vulnerability. But we hate vulnerability because it opens us up to being hurt. And we think, I don't want to be vulnerable because vulnerability, where's my slideshow? There it is the center of shame and scarcity and fear and anxiety and grief and disappointment. So I am going to armor up and self-protect. I'm not going to let people hurt me, see me, take advantage of me. The problem is that when we armor up like that, not only is vulnerability certainly the center of these experiences, it's also the center of these: love and belonging and joy. No vulnerability, no love, no belonging, no joy. What do you think is the most vulnerable human affect we experience? What's the hardest emotion for us to handle as humans? Joy. How many of you are parents? How many of you have ever stood over your child while they're sleeping and thought, oh my God, I love you like so much I can't breathe? And then in that split second, pictured something horrific happening to your child. How many of you have done that? It should be 95% of you. And this is a perfect example of that. Many years ago, when I first was studying this concept of foreboding joy, this fear we have about being joyful, I was on date night with my husband, and we come home and I see the lights still on in the kids' bedroom. I'm like, circle the block till they're tucked in, circle the block. So we go, we get some like TCVY yogurt or something. We come back, everyone's tucked in. I'm like, okay, this is awesome, let's go. And I remember we parked our car on the curb by our house, and we're walking in, and the song on the radio when we got out of the car was like one of my favorite songs, Little River Band. Do you remember the song? Like, Friday night, it was late, I was walking you home, we got down to the gate, and I was dreaming of the night. And I remember like, oh my God, this is like amazing. And we were holding hands. And I go, oh my God. And she's like, what's wrong? And I was like, do you ever think like someone's gonna jump out from behind the bushes and shoot us down? And he's like, no. Did you see somebody? And I said, no, I'm just saying, you know, like when things are going really well, you're waiting for like that to happen. Yes or no? And he's like, no. And I was like, yeah, because I mean, here's the thing. I would hope the babysitter would come out and like move us so the kids didn't find us. And he's like, oh my God, Brene. No, and I'm serious. And I don't even think on the list, it was like, I should put like a whole, like, you know, if you need to call us, if we get killed in the front yard, like something so they know to call my mom and keep the kids in the house. And he's like, he goes, I'm guessing date night's over. I'm like, oh, hell yeah, date night's over. I'm like, we gotta come up with a list, a plan. But am I alone in this? Right, because joy is so, and I'll just share this with you. What was the one variable men and women who had the capacity to lean heavily into joy? What was the one variable they shared in common? This should be a pedagogy of itself. What is the one variable that people who can really lean into joy share in common? It is part of vulnerability, but it's actually a practice. Gratitude. The only variable that really separates men and women who cannot lean into joy, who start dress rehearsing tragedy, and the reason we dress rehearse tragedy is so we can beat vulnerability to the punch. So what we do is like, oh, this great thing's happening. I'm gonna start picturing worst case scenario so that when I get hurt and it happens, I'm all prepared for it, right? But how many of you think we can actually prepare for that? You cannot. 50% of the people in this room have probably experienced the thing that we dress rehearse, and they could come up here one at a time and tell you, you can practice that all you want. That will do nothing to help you when that moment comes. The only thing you're doing is squandering the joy that you need that builds a reservoir for when hard things happen. So as it turns out, our bodies really neurobiologically experience joy as vulnerability and threat, and we quiver. And so some of us use the quiver as a warning sign to start thinking about terrible things, and others use that quiver as a reminder to be grateful, to stop on the sidewalk in that moment and say, I'm really grateful for this date night. I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for our time together. But that's harder, right? Than to go, have you ever pictured someone? So love, belonging, and joy, absolute vulnerability. But also these things, courage, empathy, trust, innovation, and creativity. No vulnerability, no innovation, no creativity. My favorite call that I get, hey Brene, would you like to come to speak to our brand new startup in Silicon Valley? It's amazing, and we loved your TED Talk, and we're bringing in thought leaders, and we want to shape our culture. And okay, great, that sounds fun. What do you want me to talk about? Anything but vulnerability and shame. I got nothing. No vulnerability, no creativity, no innovation. Accountability, adaptability to change, hard conversations. I mean, this is an easy question. How many of you think where you work, your school, your district, your grade level, how many of you think where you work would be better if people had a stronger skill set about having real, honest, respectful, hard conversations? Yes or no? Yeah, everybody. We dodge those and they become toxic in our culture. Feedback, problem solving, and ethical decision making all require vulnerability. They all require, one of my favorite stories, I'm in Canary Wharf in London talking to 150 hedge fund managers about vulnerability. They're required to attend. It was like Brooke Brothers threw up in the room. And I'm uncomfortable because I'm like, wow, these people look hostile. All men, all white, and all not happy to be there. And so I only get like 5 minutes in before someone's like, excuse me, we don't know why you're here. We're bankers, we're high compliance driven, we don't do vulnerability. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know why I'm here either. I haven't even ridden the London Eye. There's so many things I want to do. I'm not sure either. I said, what is why am I here actually? Like, what are you up against right now? And they're like, we're a high compliance banking industry. Our biggest problem right now is ethical decision making. How many of you in this room right now have ever tried to make an ethical, right decision in the face of a group moving the other direction? You will piss off some people. Yes or no? There's probably nothing more vulnerable than standing up in front of a group of people that you respect, that you work with, that you like, that you feel a sense of belonging with, and saying, this is not the right thing to do. So vulnerability is the birthplace of everything we want more of in our lives. The problem is that we end up here. Instead of having an open heart, we end up with a closed heart. We end up with a protected heart for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are environmental. Let me tell you this for sure. The greatest casualty of trauma is vulnerability. The worst thing we lose in trauma is vulnerability. And let's be very clear about what constitutes trauma. Racism is trauma. Poverty is trauma. Classism, trauma. Homophobia, heterosexism, trauma. And so the biggest casualty of that is, I can't be vulnerable. Well, when vulnerability, the ability to really be who we are, becomes a realm of only the privileged, we have lost our capacity to create a school, a home, and a country that we love. Period. Period. So there are those of us who will fight the big fight on the outside, but in no way can we give up the fight on the inside. You can make your classroom, and to some degree, if you have a collective group of brave, badass people, a whole school, but certainly in a classroom, you can, and I have seen it done many times, you can create a culture of courage within a classroom that can be the only space a child has, or an adult, even in a college classroom. I only teach graduate level, MSW, PhD, that's it. You can create a space in that classroom if you're willing to be excruciatingly uncomfortable and vulnerable. That may be the only space that student has to take the armor off his or her heart. But the one thing that will kill it faster than anything else, the one betrayal of vulnerability, is shame. That cannot happen in that classroom. And here's what you need to know before we start talking about shame. 85% of the men and women I have interviewed over the last 15 years can remember a shaming incident at school that was so devastating, it forever changed how they thought of themselves as learners. So let's do this. Raise your hand if you're in here and you can think about something that happened to you in school that changed how you thought of yourself. Right, because here's the other statistic. Over 90% of the people, the men and women we've interviewed, can remember a specific teacher, coach, or administrator who made them believe in their self-worth when no one else did. How many of you remember that teacher or that coach or that administrator? So what does that mean? So, so the question teachers always say, well, does that mean like they were doing more good or harm or what's happening? It doesn't, what it means, and let me tell you, you can be the same person. What it means is do not ever question the power you have with the people you teach. Learning is inherently vulnerable, and it's like you've got a classroom full of turtles without shells. And the minute they put the shell back on, they're protected from their peers or from the teacher or from whomever, but no learning can come in because no vulnerability, no learning. So we have to really find a way to develop shame-resilient classrooms, not shame-free, Look, here's what we know, 50 years of data. The only people who don't experience shame are people who have no capacity for empathy or connection. We all know shame. Everyone clear on shame? That warm thing that washes over you? That makes you feel small and not, so we all have it. And as long as we have a capacity for connection, shame will always be a real thing in our lives, because shame is the intensely painful belief that there's something about us that makes us unworthy of love and belonging. For children, especially in lower school, probably through about 5th grade, shame is literally the threat of being unlovable. Shame is actually neurobiologically in lower school experienced as trauma, because when you are not lovable and you're dependent on safety and nurturing and food and shelter, and you're not lovable, then that's a threat to your survival, right? So if teachers, and let me tell you, in the ranking, let me tell you exactly how it goes. Parents, teachers, clergy, peers. Because one of the things that exacerbates shaming is a power differential. So that's why we can inflict the most damage, and we can heal the most wounds. So I want to make sure we all know what we're talking about. So we're going to go through these. Let me put them all up. We're going to go through these 4 because they're radically different concepts. We use these words interchangeably, and they are completely different. And one of the 4 elements of shame resilience that the most resilient men and women have in common is they know the difference between these words, and they use the right word to express the right emotion. So shame. Shame is a focus on self. Shame is I am bad. There's something inherently wrong with me. The one we confuse it with the most is guilt. Guilt is I did something bad. Shame is a focus on self. Guilt is a focus on behavior. I hand out papers, and John gets his paper back and says, oh my God, I'm so stupid. I'm such an idiot. I'm so stupid. I'm so stupid for not studying. Shame or guilt? Shame. The focus is on him. So what about if John gets the paper back and he reads it and he says, God, not studying was such a stupid thing to do? Guilt. One's a focus on self, one's a focus on behavior. You look at a kid and you say, you are a great kid. That was a stupid choice. Guilt or shame? Guilt. So let me ask you, let me give you a visceral understanding of why this is different. How many of you in here, if you hurt my feelings, how many of you could apologize and say to me, I'm sorry, I made a mistake? How many of you could do that? I could do that with y'all. Shame, I'm sorry, I am a mistake. That's the difference between shame and guilt. Is it semantics? No, it's not semantics. Let me tell you why. Shame is highly correlated with addiction, depression, bullying, violence, eating disorders, and suicide. And here's the big piece you need to understand. Guilt is inversely correlated with those outcomes, meaning the higher the level of guilt shame talk, the less likely it is for a child to experience those outcomes. As it turns out, many researchers argue that guilt is actually a protective factor against things like addiction. That's shocking, right? And it's not just semantics. You can't, how many of you have ever experienced shame just the way someone looks at you? So you can't feel shame towards someone but use the right vocabulary and pull that off. But it's a focus on behavior. First longitudinal study they did with kids, they took a cohort of kids in 5th grade, measured whether they were shame prone or guilt prone. Meaning, did they use shame self-talk or guilt self-talk? Followed them up as seniors in high school. Shame-prone kids more likely to drop out, attempt suicide, and engage in high-risk drug and alcohol behaviors. Guilt-prone kids more likely to finish high school, apply for college, complete community service projects and hours, and engage in lower-risk sex and alcohol behaviors and drugs. It is a huge difference between shame and guilt. Does it make sense to y'all so far? Okay. Then you have humiliation. So this happened in a classroom that I was visiting. A teacher hands back papers. Everyone has a paper, right? Who didn't get a paper back? Who didn't get a paper back? Sally didn't get a paper back. How many of you are surprised that Sally did not get her paper back? Wait, keeps going. Sally, how many times have I asked you to put your name on your paper? Let me write it for you. S-T-U-P-I-D. I'm observing in the classroom as a shame researcher. But wait, so let me tell you Sally's experience here. Sally's experience is this. If Sally's self-talk is, that is the meanest, nastiest, most rotten teacher ever, awesome. Or if her okay, because that is humiliation. Let me tell you the difference between shame and humiliation. Shame is I deserved what just happened. Humiliation is I did not deserve what happened. The only thing that really separates shame and humiliation is the variable of deserving. So if Sally is saying, oh my God, you're the most hideous thing ever, and I did not deserve that, awesome. If Sally's self-talk is, I'm so stupid, why did I do that? Here's the danger, and here's why humiliation is better than shame. Because as a primary caregiver, as another teacher, as someone Sally trusts, she will not tell me if she experiences that as shame, because there's no news. What is she gonna convey? I got called stupid, I'm stupid. But if she experiences it as humiliation, she's a little pissed off. I'll never forget, oh my God, my daughter was a kindergartner and her teacher called me and she said, I always was kind of confused about what you did, now I'm clear. And I was like, oh God, why? And she said, because Ellen was in the glitter center this morning. And I said, woo, Ellen, you're messy. And she sat straight up and she said, I may be making a mess, but I am not messy. Which I was like, oh my God. I've been marked by the whole, would that spread like wildfire across teachers or yes or no? Yeah, they're like, Brene Brown, she's crazy. Make sure you add a lot of stuff in there when you're like, yeah. But that's what we've told our kids. Like, look, if you burn down the school, there are gonna be some consequences. But no matter what happens, no name calling at all. Not at school, not in this house, not with each other. Steve and I try not, we don't model that. And between siblings, let me tell you the biggest heartbreak I've ever seen probably in my research life is interviewing siblings, adult siblings who have a very disrupted relationship, who were cruel to each other. Because you know how siblings work, right? I can shame you because I know all the stuff that hurts you. I know about the acne and the struggle with the weight, and I know everything. Parents who do not intervene around that and say, that will not happen in this house. You will not talk to each other that way. If Charlie, my son's doing his homework and he's like, God, I'm so dumb. No name calling. I didn't call Ellen a name. You called yourself a name, no name calling. How else does shame show up in classrooms and in schools and in organizations? I mean, I do most of my work in like Fortune 100 companies. How does it show up there? Same way in classrooms. Favoritism, gossip, name calling. And these are adults. But that's how it shows up. The last of what we call the four conscious affects is embarrassment. Fleeting, often funny after it happens, but the hallmark of embarrassment is when we do something embarrassing, we know that we're not the only ones who have done it. Does that make sense? When you're in shame, let me tell you how shame works. Shame cannot survive being spoken. If something shaming happens to me and I can call my sister or I can tell my husband, oh my God, this was exactly what it sounded like. I'm in a shame shitstorm right now. Let me tell you what just happened. It can't hold on. Shame cannot survive being spoken because shame requires you to believe you're alone in order for it to maintain its power. Does that make sense? It's about speaking truth to shame. It's about saying, this is what happened. I feel completely alone, and like this makes me a bad person. There are three ways we defend ourselves or from shame. And I want you to think about yourself, but I also want you to think about your students, because this is something I draw on the board the first day of school. I draw these shields and I say, here are the shame shields. You feel shame. You feel not enough. You feel unworthy. You're gonna pick up one of these. You're gonna move away, move against, move toward. What is moving away? Some of us, when we feel shame, we secret keep, we hide, we get quiet. We just want to disappear. How many of you move away when you're in shame? Like, I just want to disappear. Some of us move toward. Some of us people please our way out of that emotional corner. Oh, you're so awesome. I'm really sorry. I know I suck. I'm really, we people please our way out. How many of you do that? I do all of them, sadly. And then there's moving against, which is my favorite shield and the most destructive, and that is using shame and anger to combat shame and anger. You want to dance? We'll dance. You want to do this? We'll do this. We'll totally do this. And I will emotionally annihilate you. And in the process, my self-worth and my authenticity will be just devastated, because I will walk away thinking, oh my God, who was unleashed in there? But let me ask you this. You hand a project back. How many of you, thinking about this concept, can literally see kids picking up these shields? How many of them pull their hoodie on, slump down? My daughter wore a hoodie all through middle school. We live in Houston. It's like 100 degrees. And finally, at some point, I was like, Elle, what's up? She's like, no, man, this is my invisibility cloak from Harry Potter. I was like, what do you mean? And she goes, yeah, if I put my hands in here, you can't even see me. It's like, oh, I get it. I would have totally worn those in middle school. Move toward the people pleasers, and then the people who rail against. Screw this class. She's an asshole. I hate this whole thing. Yes or no? Helping, this is not mystical information. Share this with your students. Take a picture of this thing with your phone and put it up on your class and just say, hey, when we feel bad about ourselves, when we go into shame, these are the shields we grab. The problem is when you're holding this, you can't learn and I can't see you. So let's talk about putting these down. This is the conversation. What is the antidote to shame? Is empathy. Shame, if you put shame in a petri dish and you douse it with 3 things, it will grow exponentially into every corner and crevice of your school and classroom. Shame only needs 3 things to grow like wild. Secrecy, silence, and judgment. You put that on top of shame, it's out of control. But if you put the same amount of shame in a petri dish and you douse it with empathy, you have created an environment hostile to shame. Shame cannot survive it can't survive empathy, because empathy is what? Empathy is me too. And if you don't think you're alone, you can't stay in shame. This is my favorite work on empathy. It's Teresa Wiseman's work. It's perspective taking. It's staying out of judgment, recognizing emotion and communicating it and staying mindful. And I'm going to end with this, perspective taking. The whiter, straighter, more Judeo-Christian, middle class you are, the less good you are at this. That's me too, sorry for all of us, but you know why? Because we weren't raised with critical awareness. We weren't raised with parents pointing out, hey, where are the white folks on that show? Because all the folks were white on Hee Haw. My parents did not point that out. And so when we talk about perspective taking, that is about taking the perspective of others, and that's where we have to become listeners and ask, what did this mean for you? What was this like for you? And our answer, you know the number one exacerbator of shame in conversation? Empathic failure. When a child says to you or your partner says to you, I'm in shame about this, and you go back and say, no, it's good, it's not a big deal, I promise. That's empathic failure. Tell me why this was so painful. Tell me why this was so painful. Well, it was painful because in my family, when you say this, people believe this. This is where we have to become the learners. Let me look at my time. It says 0. What if I just assume that and then I'm just starting?
My time is also at 0, so I'm going to stop
Starting.
there. So as much as I would love to do a debrief, we are way over our time, but I really chose that video because we do teach people with disabilities. We do it a lot through person-centered goals, and I'm not gonna lie, sometimes we set those person-centered goals that feed off of people's shame. Can anybody think of a specific example? I'm gonna throw it out there. Exercise goals. I've been in meetings where it was like the most positive meeting. We were talking about all this person's accomplishments, and then all of a sudden it got to the seventh person in the room who happened to be the nurse, and they were like, well, you gained 8 pounds over this year. And so the rest of that meeting discussion was all about how this person gained 7 pounds and how we were going to help that person lose that weight. So I just want to point out, check out Brené's website. She's got some really, really great podcasts and a lot of really great resources to check out. One of my biggest takeaways from her research, that the opposite of belonging is fitting in. So if you trade your authenticity for safety, you might experience the following: anxiety, depression, eating disorders, addiction, rage, blame, and inexplicable grief. So just check out her website. There's some really great content on there. And at the very beginning of this, I asked, who are your disabled role models or heroes? I want to take a moment to share mine. These are some people that have really helped me with perspective taking. Amani Barberin, she goes by Crutches and Spice on pretty much any social media platform. She's honestly my go-to if I'm like struggling with the concept of like, okay, this is interesting. I will go to her content to see if she's made any videos about that specific topic, and it definitely is so enlightening. I mentioned Lydia XZ Brown earlier, Alice Wong, the late Judy Heumann, who is a pioneer and trailblazer in human rights, and Zach Anner is a wonderful comedian. One person I left off this list because I can't let his ego get too big is Kyle Erickson. So check out Kyle Erickson comedy because he is fantastic. So thank you very much for taking the time to be here today. You know, we tackled a lot of difficult topics throughout this series. So just thank you for being on your way to creating a more inclusive and equitable world for everyone. And yes, please take a moment to fill out the evaluation. Thank you so much, everyone. Only 15 minutes over, we're doing good. Kyle, if you want to stop the recording.